Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on Doordarshan, India's national broadcaster, about India's international relations, Indian foreign policy in all its nuances, and India's involvement in a range of global institutions in order to shape a better world order. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the theme of India's involvement in the G7, the group of seven. And this grouping of industrialized countries, mostly Western industrialized countries, has existed for a long time. But India has been an invitee and is becoming a more important player in the deliberations and in trying to shape the approach of the G7 to global issues. And to discuss India and the G7, I have with me very distinguished retired practitioner of Indian diplomacy, Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar.
Thank you.
Ambassador Sajjanhar has been India's ambassador to Kazakhstan, Sweden and Latvia, and is a noted commentator on international issues in the media. Ambassador, thank you and welcome back to Indian diplomacy.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again. Thank you.
Ambassador Sajjanhar, 2003, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Prime Minister, it was the first time that the G7, or at the time it was G8, it included Russia, they invited India to be an observer. And on and off over the years, India has been going as an invitee, not as a full member. And there have been some major milestone moments, India's association with the G7. 2023, Japan is hosting G7 and again, India is an invitee and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is attending. So, in that context, if you look back at the G7 and what India has contributed to the G7 and what India has gained from being a member, an observer status in the G7, audience would like to know what is it that compels us to be part of this grouping. Does this grouping still have relevance? Because there are some people arguing that the G7 has already been superseded by the G20, and where India is holding the presidency in 2023. So why even bother about the G7? But then G7 has some agenda and does represent the rich industrialized world to a great extent. So please tell the audience India's association with G20, what we have given them and what they have given us.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sreeram, and delighted to be here again. You are very right when you say that in 2003, when India was invited for the first time to the G7 summit, there was a feeling of satisfaction and also this feeling that India had arrived and India was doing the right thing. Now, of course, if we look at the invitation that has been extended to Prime Minister Modi and he's participating in the G7 summit, this is the fifth time in a row that Prime Minister Modi is participating in the G7 deliberations. He was invited by France to Biarritz in 2019. 2020, the invitation had really been sent by President Trump to Prime Minister Modi, but then because of the pandemic, the G7 summit did not take place. In 2021, he participated virtually because of the pandemic that was taking place. And last year, he took part in Germany. And this year, it is the fifth time that India is going. But responding to your question, whether it still has a relevance or not, you know, I would say that in the 70s, it accounted for about 80% of the global GDP.
Right.
Today, it accounts for a little more than 40% of the global GDP. That having been said, it still is a very important platform. It's a very important institution, and I think India's participation is a mutually beneficial aspect for both of them. If I could just mention a few words, why is the G7 interested in India? Because India's profile is increasing, India's image is increasing. The manner in which India has been able to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, still continue the reforms. India has emerged as the fifth largest economy. India is the fastest growing major economy. So for all these reasons, India is really become a partner of choice. India has also become indispensable for the world to find solutions to several of the major challenges. You know, for instance, if we want to deal with climate change, terrorism, achieving the sustainable development goals, these aspects, these challenges cannot be confronted, cannot be fulfilled without unless India is also on board.
And Ambassador, India holding G20 presidency, perhaps that's one more reason, because we have always been the voice of the global South, and G7 for a long time had been accused of neglecting the interests of the global South or riding roughshod over them, and India obviously brings to the table the concerns of developing countries to the rich nations, and India, I think, has positioned itself as a kind of a bridge builder between the G7 and the developing world. So in that context, Japan holding the G7 presidency, India holding the G20, 2023 has been a year of convergence, and I think more G7 countries are talking about becoming responsive to the needs of developing countries. So in that context, India's presence will be, I think, highly valued, because we are not looking for the old North versus South clash, but finding ways by which the North can be more empathetic to the needs of the South, and vice versa, so that we can pragmatically go ahead and cooperate, right, at the global level.
No, you're very right. You're very right. I think India's presidency of G20 and the manner in which it is taking it forward, as Prime Minister Modi had said, it would be inclusive, it would be action-oriented. So, and the fact that Japan is holding the presidency of G7 and the summit is taking place. So, I think there is a convergence. Most of the issues that are being discussed in G20 are the same issues that are also being discussed in G7.
Right.
So, there is a huge convergence in terms of issues that are being discussed, whether we speak about climate change, whether we speak about resilient supply chains, whether we speak about debt, whether we speak about inflation. These issues are similar. Second, you mentioned about the being the voice of the global South. So India has really emerged as the voice of the global South. You would recall that in the context of India's presidency of the G20, India organized the Voice of the Global South Summit on the 12th and 13th of January. And this was basically what Prime Minister Modi had said, is that there are these 20 countries which are taking, discussing all these issues, but then, and they might represent 85% of the world GDP, 75% of the global trade, etc. But there are 180 countries out there, and their interests need also to be taken on board, because the decisions that the G20 take, the biggest impact of those decisions is going to be on those 180 countries which are out of the meeting room. And that is why we organized this, and 125 countries participated in that Voice of the Global South. So these countries are coming here. The other aspect that I could possibly underline is that all the G7 countries are members of G20.
Yeah.
And taking into account all the other invitees, there are 8 invitees, special invitees like India that Japan has invited for the G7 deliberations. So in all, there are going to be 12 countries in Hiroshima which are members of G20. So if we are looking at establishing convergences, establishing even in terms of the final declaration that will come out in September, I think some spade work could possibly be done here, because large number of countries are going to be present.
So in a way, G7 summit is a stepping stone to the G20 summit that India is hosting.
Indeed.
Viewers, we have already been talking about developing countries and their aspirations. I have a very interesting video clip of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. Germany is, of course, a core member of the G7, talking about how the rich, advanced, industrialized countries need to pay greater attention to the concerns and the thinking of developing countries. Let's listen to Chancellor Olaf Scholz and continue the discussion.
Why did influential countries such as India, South Africa or Vietnam abstain from the relevant UN resolutions calling on Russia's Russia to end its illegal invasion? These questions deserve an answer. When I talk to leaders from those countries, many assure me that they are not questioning the underlying principles of our international order. What they are struggling with is the unequal application of those principles. What they expect is representation on equal terms and an end to Western double standards. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that all of these claims are always justified. But we must address them if we want to encourage the powers in Asia, Africa, and the Americas to join us in building and defending a stable global order. Take steps toward creating secure and resilient economies based on partnerships with the global South. And act on the challenges faced by developing and emerging markets, ranging from the urgent threat of the climate crisis to the critical need for infrastructure. I will also remain personally committed to working towards a more inclusive, more equitable global order, particularly when it comes to our neighboring continent, Africa.
So, viewers, you saw the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz talking about how he personally and his country must be more responsive to the issues being faced, the specific challenges being faced by developing countries. Ambassador Sajjanhar, Olaf Scholz has also in the past echoed India's External Affairs Minister Dr. Subramaniam Jaishankar that Europe should not have double standards and the world's problems should also be Europe's problems. It should not just be vice versa where Europe's problems are being transposed on everyone. So clearly he has been one leader within the G7 who has been very open to the calls from the rest who are not there. The 180 plus countries that you mentioned, that the it should not be an inequitable process and that global institutions ought to be fairer and more equitable. So in that context, the G7 is talking about debt issues, food, fuel crises, inflationary pressures, climate issues, healthcare, all the issues that India has been highlighting through the Voice of the Global South mechanism and also at the G20. So can we be hopeful that the G7 will do more than lip service to this? Because while Chancellor Scholz is talking about this, they often seem to be obsessed with one or two issues that are very Eurocentric only. For example, the Ukraine war and rolling back the Russian invasion, but not thinking about the broader global ramifications and repercussions. So can we be hopeful that the G7 is finally going to see the light and think more broadly and more inclusively than it used to in the past?
I think there is increasing realization and increasing recognition by the G7 that they need to take on board the concerns of the global South or the developing countries. And this, I think, even Prime Minister Kishida has been mentioning this in, at every step when he was here in March for launching the free and open Indo-Pacific. He mentioned several times that global South, the interests and the concerns of the global South will definitely be taken on board. And you would recall that, when he announced the provision for $75 billion to create infrastructure.
Yes.
Then he mentioned that there are 3 segments, geographical segments that he is creating. South Asia, in which he had put Northeast India, creating infrastructure there. Bangladesh and how together it could be worked out. Then Southeast Asia, what is the sort of infrastructure, and of course Africa. The Pacific Island states, the Pacific. So because in the Indo-Pacific he was doing it. So these are the 3 segments that he had created. And also he wants to make sure, Prime Minister Kishida, because Japan is the only country from Asia in the G7. 2 of them are from Americas, all the others are from European. So he wants that the focus, as you mentioned, Professor Chaulia, that it should not be taken over completely by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Not only Eurocentric issues, but there should be focus also on Asia, and particularly in terms of the assertiveness and the belligerence of China in the East China Sea, in South China Sea, and other areas, other regions. That he wants to focus on, and also ensure that it should be a free and open, inclusive Indo-Pacific.
And in that context, Ambassador, it's quite telling that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida invited a certain set of countries for the G7 who do want to be part of the free and open Indo-Pacific. So Vietnam is there, Australia is there, Indonesia has been invited, South Korea, and of course India. So, and I think one of the Pacific islands, Cook Islands, is also there. So there is the Indo-Pacific flavor to G7 Summit 2023 compared to earlier times. And I think because Japan is hosting it, naturally, the regional consciousness will reflect of the regional consciousness of the host country will reflect in the summit. And to that extent, there is an attempt to, like you said, take the gaze away from only just what is happening in the global north to what is happening here in the Pacific and what needs to be done. So G7 has aspirations like NATO, which is of course all the G7 countries also are in NATO, and NATO has also been saying that they will move towards Indo-Pacific and have a greater, there's for a long time pivot to Asia kind of idea for almost 15 years now, since Barack Obama's time. But now the attempt seems to be to do something concrete in Asia much more than before. Although it's an open question as to whether all the G7 member countries share the same view.
Yeah, you're very right. I think what Prime Minister Kishida's intent and what he's tried to achieve through inviting these 8 guest member countries is basically to make G7 also more inclusive, because this has been one of the charges that it is a rich man's club and you really need to reach out. So you have Brazil from South America, and Brazil is going to be the next chair of G20. Indonesia, as you mentioned, is the chair of ASEAN. Cook Islands is the chair of Pacific Island states. Comoros is the chair of the African Union. So all these countries, and of course South Korea for an entirely different reason, because the meeting is going to take place in Hiroshima, which is also Prime Minister Kishida's hometown. But it is also the scene of the 1945 August nuclear attack. So he wants to sort of focus also on nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. And there he wants to focus particularly on the threats that have been emanating out of Russia as far as the Russia-Ukraine conflict is concerned, because that muscle flexing also we have seen, and these threats we have seen. Also the fact that from North Korea there have been all these missile tests and all that are being done, and all the sort of comments that have been emanating from there. So I think it is all these aspects are there, but you are very right when you say that there is less than unanimity as far as the G7 itself is concerned in either dealing with Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, although this Russia-Ukraine conflict has given a fresh sense of purpose both to G7, to NATO, to European unity. But also I think the intent, the objective of Prime Minister Kishida will be to get a strong unified statement on
China,
both on Russia, on Ukraine, but also on China as far as the security here is concerned, and also as far as the economic collaborations with China, because these days there has been increasing focus on de-risking, if not decoupling of the economies.
Viewers, talking of the geopolitical angle of G7, Ambassador Sajjanhar has already mentioned the China factor, and Japanese hosts are keen to highlight it, the Americans are keen to highlight it, and the Americans are talking about creating some kind of a joint position of all the G7 countries on confronting what they call economic coercion by China. Let's hear the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen at the G7 finance ministers meeting in Japan talking about this aspect and what the G7 needs to. Let's hear her and continue.
Restrictions on outbound investment is something that could be the subject of an executive order, and it's something we've been discussing internally in the administration for some time. We're committed to discussing this with our partners. Obviously, it would be most effective if there's coordinated action by a group of like-minded countries and agreement that this is a useful approach. We haven't finalized the approach that we're likely to take in the United States, and we have been engaging in discussions with our G7 colleagues, and I would expect that that would continue with these meetings, at least in some informal way. There have been examples of China using economic coercion on countries that take actions that China's not happy with from a geopolitical perspective. Australia's suffered that, Lithuania, there are other countries, and that's a matter that should be of concern to all of us. I'm certainly aware of the examinations that they've conducted of American firms recently, consultancies operating in China. I don't know if I would include that in the same bucket. And I don't have anything concrete to say by way of plans, but I would say that many G7 members share a common concern with this kind of activity and are looking to see what we could jointly do to try to counter this kind of behavior.
Right. So, viewers, U.S. Treasury Secretary is saying that there are common concerns in the G7 about Chinese economic coercion and how China weaponizes the interdependence and punishes countries that do not toe its line on geopolitical issues. Ambassador Sajjanhar, the U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, has been quoted as saying that G7 will go beyond just mere words, and the plan is to deter and to defend member countries and others who are affected by this Chinese economic coercion, and that they will have concrete tools to fight back. Now, presumably already there is, bilaterally, between China and many G7 countries, there are export restrictions to China, checks on investments in China, and also inward investments coming from China into these rich countries. There is now more scrutiny so that they don't take over a high-tech, scientific base of these countries and steal the secrets. So there's already a lot of, fear and suspicion of what China is doing. But again, to come back to the old question, can the G7, even with the push from Australia and India and other, Quad summit is also happening simultaneous to G7 summit in Japan in 2023. Can you foresee a joint front to push back this kind of behavior that Janet Yellen is talking about and criticizing? Or will we still look at individual interests rather than the group interests or the interests of the international order as a whole? Because rules-based order is something everybody talks about, but in their individual conduct as foreign policies, sometimes you find G7 countries not necessarily all falling in line, at least not as the US wants them to be.
Yeah, the way I look at it is that I think there is increasing recognition amongst all the G7 and also beyond that G7 pale that China has been, for instance, weaponizing, the supply chains. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, that even simple items like masks and like ventilators, etc., they were weaponized if countries were not, towing their line. For instance, China asked for an independent investigation into
Australia.
The origin.
Yeah.
Australia asked for an independent investigation, and you saw what the response was in terms of exports of minerals from Australia to China, movement of tourists from China to Australia and students, etc. So China has been weaponizing its economic control over engagement, dependence, interdependence with these countries. And so countries are becoming wiser to what this. So they don't want that there should be dependence beyond a point on China. So they want additional sources of manufacturing and production. And in that context, you would have seen that, even as far as India is concerned, we had the first meeting of the Trade and Technology Council, in which there is a move.
India-Europe.
India-Europe.
Yeah,
With India-EU, there was this Trade and Technology Council meeting. And also on the Indo-Pacific, there was a meeting between India and the EU in Sweden. So I think there are these, many of these countries are getting wiser to this. And then also countries have seen this debt diplomacy, that what you see in Sri Lanka, what you see in Laos, what you see in a number of other countries. And so whether it is sensitive technologies, it is sophisticated technologies, or it is over dependence on one particular source of manufacture and production, I think countries want to move away from that. They want to go in for reliable supply chains, and in that context, the whole concept of trust has come in. And China has been seen that it is not a country that can be trusted. And when I'm talking about trust, it's not things like IPRs or data privacy. I think it is much more fundamental than that.
Yes.
That if two countries are trading with each other or investing in each other's economy, that it will be, there is a basic level of trust between them. And I think in that context, India has come forward in a very positive way.
So viewers, the point Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar is making is that, when China engages with countries, it is almost becoming a one-sided affair where China gets most of the benefits and it attains a kind of a neo-colonial control over those countries. And this is what the G7, Quad, all of us are talking about, the need to push back against this. But really the test of G7 and of Quad will be on whether we can really develop those quote-unquote tools to be able to deter this kind of Chinese action. The Chinese have not been happy with G7 and Quad and have been repeatedly criticizing it, saying that this is a Western game and which is dividing developing countries against each other and so on and so forth. But then the point is there is a real threat that many of us perceive from Chinese economic coercion, and the real litmus test for G7 will going forward will be whether it can implement or walk the talk. I want to thank Ambassador Ashok Sajjanhar for valuable insights as always. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Viewers, keep your eye on G7 and G20, how these are interlinked, and of course the Quad, and whether we can actually create a super coalition of G7 plus Quad, which will be, I think, the nightmare for China. But it remains to be seen given all the internal differences. So a lot of coordination, a lot of diplomacy will be needed going forward. Let's watch this carefully. I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.